Lecture 10: Economic Globalization and the Rise of Neoliberalism in the Late 20th Century. 1. The oil shocks of the 1970s and global economic crises. The global economic landscape of the late 20th century was profoundly shaped by the oil shocks of the 1970s, which marked the end of the post-World War II economic boom. In 1973, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, imposed an oil embargo in response to Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadrupled, leading to what became known as the First Oil Shock. This was followed by a second oil shock in 1979, triggered by the Iranian Revolution, which caused further volatility in oil supply and prices. These shocks had wide-ranging consequences. Industrialized economies, especially in the West, suffered from stagflation, a combination of stagnation and inflation that defied traditional Keynesian economic tools. High inflation and unemployment plagued countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom. Moreover, developing nations, heavily dependent on imported oil and burdened with rising debt, experienced severe balance of payment crises. The oil shocks also exposed structural weaknesses in the Bretton Woods system, which had already been destabilized by the U.S. decision to suspend dollar-gold convertibility in 1971. The collapse of fixed exchange rates and the surge in commodity prices contributed to uncertainty in international markets. Governments struggled to maintain economic stability, leading to a crisis of confidence in state-led, demand-side economic models. This paved the way for alternative ideologies, most notably neoliberalism, to rise in prominence. 2. Neoliberal economic policies, Reaganomics and Thatcherism. In response to the perceived failure of Keynesianism, a new economic paradigm emerged: neoliberalism, advocating free market solutions, deregulation, privatization, and a reduced role for the state in the economy. The intellectual foundations of neoliberalism can be traced to economists such as Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, who emphasized the inefficiencies of government intervention and the self-regulating power of markets. Two of the most influential political embodiments of neoliberalism were Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. Their policy approaches, Reaganomics and Thatcherism, respectively, sought to revive national economies by implementing four major strategies. Tax cuts. Reagan introduced significant tax reductions, especially for high-income earners and corporations, under the belief that such policies would stimulate investment and economic growth. Supply-side economics. Monetary restraint. Both leaders prioritized controlling inflation through tight monetary policies, including raising interest rates, a strategy associated with Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker in the early 1980s. Deregulation. Key industries, finance, telecommunications, energy, and transportation were deregulated to encourage competition and reduce government bureaucracy. Privatization. Public enterprises were sold off, and public services were outsourced to private companies, reshaping the state's role in welfare provision and industrial planning. These reforms had mixed results. While inflation was curbed and stock markets flourished, income inequality widened, labor unions weakened, and many social safety nets were diminished. Unemployment initially rose in both countries, and critics argued that neoliberal policies disproportionately benefited the wealthy, while marginalizing the working class. Nevertheless, neoliberalism gained hegemonic status in global economic policy discourse. International financial institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, began promoting structural adjustment programs, SAPs, in developing countries, requiring deregulation, trade liberalization, and fiscal austerity as conditions for loan soften with painful social consequences. 3. Financial globalization and the rise of multinational corporations. The 1980s and 1990s witnessed a dramatic acceleration of financial globalization, driven by advancements in technology, capital mobility, and policy liberalization. National boundaries became increasingly porous to the flow of goods, services, and especially capital. This financial revolution reshaped the global economy in several key ways. Deregulation of capital markets. Governments relaxed restrictions on foreign exchange controls, allowing money to move freely across borders. This gave rise to an explosion in global capital flows and international investment. Expansion of multinational corporations, MNCs. Global corporations became dominant players, spreading their production networks across continents. Through foreign direct investment, FDI, MNCs set up manufacturing hubs in countries with cheaper labor and fewer regulations, especially in Asia and Latin America. Offshoring and outsourcing companies began relocating production and services to countries with comparative advantages in cost and efficiency. This resulted in the deindustrialization of many Western economies and the industrialization of the Global South, particularly in countries like China, India, and Mexico. Rise of financial instruments. The development of complex financial products such as derivatives, hedge funds, and securitized assets expanded the scope of global finance. While these instruments provided new opportunities for wealth creation and risk management, they also introduced volatility and systemic risk. As later seen in the 2008 financial crisis, this phase of globalization was accompanied by the growing influence of institutions, like the World Trade Organization (WTO), which replaced GATT in 1995 and promoted global free trade. The increased clout of global financial markets often limited the autonomy of national governments in setting economic policies, giving rise to what some critics called a market civilization. 4. The Information Revolution and the emergence of the digital economy. Another transformative development of the late 20th century was the information revolution, driven by advances in computing, telecommunications, and the Internet. The digital revolution fundamentally altered how economies functioned and how globalization unfolded. Key aspects of the digital economy include automation and productivity gains. Technological advances increase productivity in manufacturing and services, often with fewer workers. Robotics, computer-aided design, and just-in-time inventory systems redefined production processes. Internet and communication technology (ICT). The Internet became a key infrastructure for global commerce, enabling real-time communication, data transfer, and digital transactions across continents. E-commerce platforms like Amazon and Alibaba and social media networks, such as Facebook and Google, redefined consumer behavior and business models. Knowledge economy value creation shifted increasingly from material goods to intangible assets, data, intellectual property, software, and innovation. Human capital and education became central to economic competitiveness. Platform capitalism. Major tech companies emerged as dominant global actors. By controlling digital platforms, their ability to extract and monetize user data became the new driver of economic value, raising concerns about data privacy, market monopolies, and digital labor precarity. The digital economy also deepened inequalities. While it generated immense wealth for tech entrepreneurs and skilled workers, it also displaced many traditional jobs, creating a digital divide between those with access to technology and those without. Moreover, global labor markets became segmented with a rise in gig work, informal employment, and platform-mediated labor exploitation. Conclusion. The legacy of late 20th century globalization. The late 20th century saw a profound restructuring of the global economic system. The oil shocks of the 1970s triggered a crisis of the post-war order, allowing neoliberalism to ascend as the dominant economic ideology. Under the banner of free markets, deregulation, and privatization, Western powers reshaped national and global institutions. This period also witnessed the rise of global finance, the spread of multinational corporations, and the beginnings of a truly interconnected digital economy. While these changes generated unprecedented wealth and integration, they also introduced instability, inequality, and environmental degradation. By the end of the 20th century, economic globalization had become a defining feature of the international order, praised by some for its efficiency and innovation, but criticized by others for its social dislocations and democratic deficits. These dynamics laid the foundation for many of the political and economic tensions that would erupt in the 21st century, from populist backlash to debates over global governance.